So I wanted to look at the shaping of masculinity at the intersection of gender, class, and ethnicity. And I decided to choose 3 groups. I chose white working class men, but I did not choose them from Pittsburgh. Can you guess why?
At that time, was it the steel mill?
Was
it the steel industry at that time? So.
Well, no, the demise had already started in terms of the steel industry. That wouldn't have been part of the equation. I needed social distance. If I come in and I interview people that I'm just really familiar with, the argument is that I'm not going to have the same level of objectivity that I might have if I chose some different groups. And I had already, I told you, I've been at Erie a long time, so masculinity up there doesn't necessarily look the same as it does down here. I'll give you one easy example. People here are very pro-union, the working class guys. In Erie, it's just the opposite. In Erie, they came out of this agrarian background and were kind of suspicious of the unions. They could really identify with the owners of the manufacturing plants, that sort of thing. You did have unions in Erie, but there was a lot more tenuousness in the relationship between even the men on the floor than down here. It was very, very different. And I mean, I remember growing up in 9th grade Pennsylvania history class. We learned about the unions. We learned about the Homestead riots. We learned about protecting our labor. I mean, I remember, you know, even though some of the other teachers might have said, well, you're just going to the mill anyway, for whatever reason they decided to teach us that. So that's one group. Another group was the black working class guys out of my neighborhood. And we still kind of, I mean, we're on the outskirts now, but there were still relationships. I still have family, we still have family in and around North Braddock. Now they're in Penn Hills and some of the other places. But I thought it would be interesting to take a look at masculinity making, going at it in terms of what must it be like for these boys becoming men to have to face institutional racism as well as regular racism. How does that impact masculinity making? And I actually have a video clip I want to show you, and I'll talk about it more when I go to play it, that is a documentary that was done in, a lot of the interviews are from Braddock and North Braddock of these black steel workers. It's called Struggles in Steel. I'm only going to show you about 30 minutes of it. But if you ever get a chance to see this, this was done locally. And I'll give you more of that later. And then the other group, and this other group I chose specifically to try to address Chodero's ideas, was the Amish. I actually managed to get some interviews with the Amish. And I won't tell you how hard that was, because I had to get them audio taped, right? So I could get the transcripts. It's a socio-religious minority embedded in the predominant culture, right? They pride themselves at continuing to manage technology and preserve the agrarian nature of the culture. So I was thinking, well, if there's any place that I could kind of test this out in terms of Chodero's ideas, they would be the subculture. So I ended up, and I know this is not going to sound like many interviews, but this sucker took me 3 years to do, right? So I've got 30 interviews, 10 with each. I'm going to call, that's black working class, white working class, and the Amish. I ended up with somewhere around 3,000 pages of transcript notes. Those are the transcript. And at that time, this was still fairly primitive in terms of technology, but there was a program that I used to kind of code the data, because it's a qualitative study, right, in-depth interviews, and it was called Ethnograph. So I would go through these interviews over and over and over again, looking for patterns, trying to see what was in there. The interviews lasted anywhere from probably about 50 minutes to 2.5 hours was the longest. And yeah, the Amish were, it was interesting, all the research bargains I had to create. You know, for example, I have never ever played one of those. I have them all, but I've never played them for anyone. Why would you think that is? They made me promise. This is only for your research, right? Also, in the beginning, I tried to get what they call Old Order Amish, which are the more stringent sects, S-E-C-T-S. But I didn't have much success there. And what I did was to put, I started to subscribe to an Amish newspaper. It's called The Budget. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It comes out once every 2 weeks. And it's all the happenings in the various Amish communities, right? Who got married, who died, you know, how the harvest is coming, that kind of stuff. It really is very cute. I don't want to necessarily romanticize it. But in these newspapers, there would be an article from each and every community, kind of eastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, as far to almost Lancaster. And there would be an article from all those communities. They'd submit them, and then they would put them in the newspaper, and they would have the name of they called them scribes, the one that would write the article. Well, I contacted the newspaper and then contacted the scribes. And that is actually the way that I finally got into a couple of communities that realized that I was a brother in the Lord. I wasn't out to do them any harm. If anything, I'm you know, trying to bring something positive out of these interviews. And once I finally got in, it was good. With the black working class guys, I don't think I ever would have gotten the interviews had it not been that we were a known commodity. The family was a known commodity. My grandfather happened to be the football trainer for like 38 years at the high school that we went to. And a lot of these guys remember my granddad. So all I had to do was talk about Big Jim, and I was in. So that, and I think that's the only reason, because in some of those interviews, the concern on the part of these fellas was, are you going to take this as a white researcher and make us look bad? Because a lot of people have done that kind of thing. So that was the concern, and you could see it. They're like, okay, I've agreed to this interview, and then they start to disclose a little of whatever it is I asked them about, and then you could see them pause and think, do I really want to do this, right? And then I would try to reassure them. I'll share one quick story there. And all the names, if I throw names out, they're all changed, so there's no way to identify anybody. But I had an 87-year-old retired steel worker that my uncle, who was a postman, had a relationship with down in Braddock. And he agreed to let me interview him. And he chronicled his story migrating from the South. I don't remember if it was South Carolina or North Carolina, but he came up in late teens, early 20s, if I'm remembering it correctly, and came up as a boy. At that time, many of the African Americans were migrating north, right, looking for work. It was really a challenge to find decent work and pay in the South. The companies, the steel companies here in the North, were thrilled to get them because they could kind of use that labor as another group to kind of pit against the existing groups and try to keep the wages low. Now, Jesse's telling me these stories. And it was an interesting interview because as he's telling it, he's tapping on the table, and I'm wondering, oh my gosh, how's this going to affect the recording? Tap, 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 tap. And he's got tears just hanging in the very bottom of his eyelids. They just hung there. A tear never like dropped, it just hung there. And he begins to tell all of these experiences that he had gone through. And at a certain point he says to me, I've never told another living soul what I'm telling you. Not another person, right? And as he's going on, I'm thinking about my interview with the Institutional Review Board that, made me promise that I wouldn't do any harm out there in terms of actually doing research. And I'm wondering, am I, going for this stuff? Is this really harmful to these guys? And not just the black working class guys, but wondering about it too with some of the others, because they all had strong reactions once they finally kind of started to talk about things. So Jesse's there, and I'm getting worried, and he was really quite a gentleman. Made sure he fed me. That was an interesting thing. Fed me. Actually sent me, as I went to leave, he tucked pretzels under my arm and a bottle of something in my hand as I'm getting ready to leave. And he says to me, because his countenance changed right at the end, right at the very end, and he, whatever distress he was experiencing was no longer. And he says to me, I want to let you know what an honor it is to have a white man grace my shack and ask me what I think. Yeah. I get the word from my uncle about 3 weeks later that Jesse passes away. And the word that went from the family to my uncle was how after that interview he couldn't talk about anything else. The fact that he had put his story out there. And the family, said to send thanks my way. It's funny how you do these things. You have your own research agendas, and they actually take on a life of their own in terms of, you could argue, being therapeutic, or, the guy had a chance to tell his life story. If they think human development, right, that last stage with Erickson, in terms of kind of tying up all those loose ends, integrity versus despair, right? He really told it. And then the white working class guys, they were an interesting bunch. Of the three groups, they were the ones that disclosed the least. They were the ones I had to really work hard to get anything out of. And I remember one fellow saying to me that part of the rationale for that is that they didn't want to be identified as complaining. They all had their own stories of hardship, right? Because that's really what all of this toughening thing is that goes on with boys becoming men. It's an effort, if we think functionally now, not in terms of the extreme. The idea here is that most cultures want to toughen the boy in an effort to be able to withstand the hardships of life. So most cultures are going to have a way to kind of make that happen.